Okay, welcome everyone. So glad to see so many people out tonight and so many students in the audience. My name is Sandra Segutis-Emsch, and I'm the director of the Center for Educational Excellence here at the university. And I'm truly honored to be able to introduce our guest speaker tonight, and author of this year's USD Just Read selection, Bottled and Sold. For those of you who do not know, the USD Just Read program was established as a way for our community to engage in important common read experience that approaches important themes of our day with an interdisciplinary eye and aligns with the mission of our institution. This year's selection fits perfectly with the water theme of the Changemaker Hub and all the sustainability efforts on our campus. The book is also a wonderful example of interdisciplinary studies examining the role that economics, science, psychology, marketing, policy, and environmental studies, to name a few, play in water systems management and human consumption behavior. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the support of so many entities on campus, and we have all the different co-sponsors here on this slide. So we are very happy to see almost every school and office and department on campus contributing to this common read experience. We are very excited to be able to bring to you tonight the author of this year's selection, Dr. Peter Gleick. Dr. Gleick is renowned the world over as a leading expert, innovator, and communicator on water and climate issues. He co-founded and leads the Pacific Institute in Oakland, created in 1987, and now one of the most innovative, independent, non-governmental organizations addressing global water challenges. Dr. Gleick's work has redefined water from the realm of engineers to the world of social justice, sustainability, human rights, and integrated thinking. His influence on the field of water has been long and deep. He developed one of the earliest analysis of climate change impacts on water resources and defined basic human needs for water and the human right to water, work that has been used by the UN and in human rights court cases. He pioneered the concept of the soft path for water, developed the idea of peak water, and has written about the remarkable history and background of the growing bottled water phenomenon. Dr. Gleick is a MacArthur Genius Fellow, was named a visionary on the environment by the BBC, and is an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And in 2008, Wired magazine featured Dr. Gleick as one of the 15 people that the next president should listen to. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gleick.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's an honor to have my book selected. I had a wonderful day talking with students and faculty today. Thanks to all of the organizations that those of you in the back of the room can't read. There are some seats up front. If you're in the back of the room, you'll have a little more trouble seeing the slides, but you might have a little easier time sleeping. I understand the trade-off for students. So I'm going to talk about water. I'm going to talk about bottled water in particular in the context of the book, Bottled and Sold, but I want to start, if I can, with a little bit of an overview, just to put it in context, of the broader challenges we face about water. Water is a big issue. It's connected to everything we care about. It's connected to the production of food. It's connected to the way we use energy. It's connected to human rights and ecosystem values. It's connected to human health. It's connected to almost everything that we care about, and it's an interdisciplinary problem. It isn't just a problem of engineering or hydrology or climatology. It's a problem of sociology and politics and culture and economics. And that's one of the things that makes it so interesting, but it's also one of the things that makes it so challenging. So at the broader level, we have lots of challenges. The biggest is probably the failure globally to meet basic human needs for safe water, safe and affordable water for everyone. It's the 21st century, and there are around 800 million people worldwide that don't have access to safe drinking water, something everyone in this room takes for granted. There are probably 2.5 billion people worldwide, 40% of the world's population, that don't have access to adequate sanitation. And those basic human needs, the failure to meet those basic human needs for water, is probably what I would consider the most serious water challenge facing us. And the failure to meet basic human needs leads to bad things. It leads to water-related diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, the things that we got rid of in the richer countries of the world 100 years ago when we put in place the municipal water systems that provide our tap water today. We had cholera, we had dysentery, we had typhoid in all of the major cities of the United States and Europe, and they disappeared when we built the municipal water systems that all of us, again, take for granted today. There's local scarcity. There are water-rich areas of the world and there are water-poor areas of the world. And as populations grow, as our economies grow, we're seeing more and more depletion of water resources, and we're seeing more and more competition for the water resources that we have. And California's in a severe drought now. For those of you born and raised in California, you know that we fight over water in California. There's competition between the agricultural sector and the urban sector and the environment over water resources because California is a relatively water-scarce area compared to other parts of the United States and other parts of the world. We have contamination problems in much of the world. We contaminate water with industrial and human wastes. We have technology that cleans water. That technology is not widely or universally distributed, and so there are water contamination problems. There are challenges associated with the production of food and the goods and services that we make. And there are connections with industrial activities, there are connections with corporate activities around the world associated with our footprint, the water required to produce the goods and services that we all consume. We have ecosystem problems. All of the water that we use comes out of natural ecosystems, comes out of the rivers and streams that used to take all of the water before we were around. And a lot of the ecosystem problems around the world are associated with our use of water. We consume the entire flow, for example, of the Colorado River. And some of San Diego's water comes from the Colorado River. And no water reaches the mouth of the delta of the Colorado anymore, which happens to be in Mexico. And there are many examples around the world where we consume the entire flow of rivers, or because of water contamination problems, we have ecosystem challenges. On top of it all, we're changing the climate. The climate is changing. It's changing because of human activities. There's no scientific uncertainty about that. And some of the most significant impacts of climate change will be on water resources. As the climate changes, will affect demand for water. As temperature goes up, we'll see changes in precipitation patterns, storm patterns off the Pacific. We have an El Nino this year, which is a sea surface temperature phenomenon, hot temperatures across the Pacific. And those temperatures are higher than they would otherwise be now because of climate change. And we're losing snowpack because of climate change. There are all sorts of a whole series of implications of climate change that will affect water resources around the world. And we fight over water. Water is a political issue in many parts of the world, and there's a long history of political conflict over water. One of the things we do at the Pacific Institute, which is the institute I manage up in Oakland, is we track water conflicts going back 5,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia, which is the ancient Middle East. And some of the conflicts we see over water today are, ironically enough, in those same regions of the world. So these are our water challenges. They're many, they're complicated, they're interdisciplinary, they're difficult challenges. And to some degree, the issue of bottled water is a tiny piece of that puzzle. That's what I'm going to mostly talk about tonight. But in the broader context of water, if you're interested in water, if you're interested in social justice, if you're interested in economics, if you're interested in engineering, And if you're interested in water, there's a lot for you to do. This is a full employment opportunity. So I'm going to talk about bottled water in the context of some of these bigger issues, but mostly focused around some of the phenomenon, the history of our consumption of bottled water. It's sort of an amazing story for those of us who have grown up through that history. And let me start here, which is the consumption of bottled water per person in the United States from 1976 to 2014. And what it shows a number of different things. First of all, it shows an inexorable rise in the consumption of bottled water. And for those of you in the back who can't read the slides, it's 1976 on the x-axis up to 2014, and it's gallons per person per year from 0 to 40. And the first thing to notice that in the 1970s, the consumption of bottled water per person in the United States was pretty close to 0. None. And today, it's over 30 gallons per person per year. That's the average bottled water consumption in the United States. And there was this little blip. It dropped a little bit in the late 2000s. In part, I think because of some particularly aggressive activism around bottled water, in part because of an economic recession, and we stopped spending money on a lot of different things, but the consumption has started to grow again. And 30 gallons per person per year is a lot of bottled water. And I'd like to think that there's nobody in this room who is at that average, but that's the average consumption in the United States. It's a lot of bottled water. And that's part of this phenomenon. So I grew up when the numbers were really close to 0. I grew up in New York City with fantastic municipal water, great tasting water. And if my mother had gone, and my mother did the shopping, if my mother had gone to the store and brought home bottled water, that would have been a really, really strange thing. And yet today, that's done all the time. So I'm going to talk about why we do this. Why do we buy bottled water? And I'm going to talk about a lot of pieces of this puzzle. One of them is increasingly we fear our tap water. We don't trust it. We're not sure what's coming out of the tap. Sometimes we don't like the taste of our tap water, and I hear that a lot. Sometimes we can't find tap water in public. It's hard to find, and bottled water is everywhere. I work at an office in downtown Oakland. I can tell you half a dozen places to find bottled water, to buy bottled water, and I can't tell you where the nearest water fountain is, although I have perfectly potable tap water in my office. Advertising and marketing. We're convinced by advertising and marketing to buy all sorts of things that we don't really need. And advertising for bottled water is like advertising for anything. They try to convince us that buying this product will make us healthier or sexier or more popular or solve some problem that we didn't know we had. And one of the things the US is really good at is advertising. There's a science to advertising. And we're all subjects of that. So let me start with each of these. Let me start with fear of the tap. To some degree, especially in the mid-years, the early years and the mid-years of the bottled water industry, there was a war on tap water. And the war on tap water took this form. Tap water is poison. That's a quote from a flyer, and I'll show you a picture of this a little bit later, touting the stock of a bottled water company in Texas. Went around saying, tap water is poison. We're a bottled water company, buy our stock. So make money on the coming boom in tap water. Here's a quote from a woman who was, at the time, the president of Quaker Oats Company's beverage division. Quote, when we're done with our advertising campaign, Tap water will be relegated to showers and washing dishes. The competition, the perception of the competition of the beverage industry was tap water was the competition. And if we can dissuade people from that option, our option, bottled water, is a better deal. Another quote from Robert Morrison, Pepsi, at the time, PepsiCo's North American Beverage and Food Division chairman, quote, "The biggest enemy is tap water. We're not against water, it just has its place. We think it's good for irrigation and cooking." Now, Pepsi and Quaker Oats and Coke and the big companies, they're smarter today. You will not find any of these top executives saying this anymore. But for a while, for a long time, tap water was explicitly the target of the bottled water industry. They wanted you to switch products. You can't see this in the back. This is an image from that flyer from that stock company, and I've just circled, tap water is poison. This came in the mail. Tap water is poison. That's the fear option. This is the flyer. It actually came to my neighbor, and he brought it over to my house. Said, "There's something in this glass you don't want to drink, and it's not the fish. It's something that you can't see. It's invisible. You might think your tap water is good, but there's something invisible that you ought to be afraid of. It's the fear question." Another ad. This is an old ad from Brita. Brita doesn't sell bottled water, they sell filters to convince you that your tap water is not good enough. You can buy a filter and filter out whatever might or might not be in your tap water. We'd like to clear up a few things about tap water. That's a nice pun right there. And there are other things that says, tap water becomes wonderful water. Again, the implication is it's not now wonderful water, but buy our product, and once again, it'll be wonderful. It'll be a wonderful thing. Access, public access to water. Water fountains. They're increasingly hard to find. It's hard to find a water fountain. And sometimes when you do, somehow the maintenance hasn't been kept up to date. Or it's dirty, or you think it's dirty, or you're not sure if it's dirty. There's a perception problem. And for those of you who actually read my book, or at least the first 5 pages, this story will be familiar. And for those of you who haven't, let me tell you a little story. The University of Central Florida built a brand new football stadium, and it finished in 2007. 46,000 seats, or something like that. And opening day in the fall of football season in 2007, sold out crowd, 100-degree day, 45,300 seats. 0 water fountains. They built this stadium with no water fountains, which I actually think was a violation of Florida building code. The University of Central Florida and I have a disagreement about that. But be that as it may, whether or not they were required, there were no water fountains. They had 30,000 bottles of water at the concession stands for 45,000 seats. And by halftime, those bottles of water were gone. And by the end of the day, 78 people went to the hospital for dehydration and heat stroke because they ran out of water. Water fountains, public access to water. Now, this is actually a fascinating story. It's a deeper story, which I wasn't going to tell, but maybe I'll give some hints at it, about student activism and about social media. So the university's first reaction was, we didn't have to build water fountains. We're sorry, next time we'll have more bottled water. But a student launched a Facebook campaign demanding that they build water fountains. And the university's first response for a few days from the PR division was, oh, you know, we'll solve this another way. But student after student joined this campaign at the university, and it gained, in a very short period of time, a lot of momentum. And within a week, the university announced that they were going to put 40 water fountains in the stadium, and they did. They restructured and they rebuilt 40 public fountains at the stadium. So it was an interesting story about public access, but it was also an interesting story about student activism and social media. And maybe there's a lesson there. Advertising. Will Rogers said, advertising is the art of convincing people to spend money they don't have for something they don't need. There you go. But the president of the American Association of Advertising Agencies 80 years ago said, quote, "It may be necessary to fool people for their own good. Average intelligence is surprisingly low. It is so much more effectively guided by its subconscious impulses and instincts than by reason." Okay, so first of all, this is incredibly insulting. Second of all, this is the philosophy of the advertising agencies. People are often, realistically, guided by impulses, guided by perception, guided by subconscious desires. I'm a scientist. I'm sure there are psychologists and advertising and branding people in the audience that understand this better than I. But this is the way advertising works. And it goes back to this first quote. It's the art of convincing people to spend money. And we'll leave it at that. Whether or not you need something, it's the art of convincing people to make decisions with their dollars. And the bottled water industry understands this, as do all industries. So here's some examples of bottled water industry. This is Evian. Okay, so there are two images here, really. There are two messages here. One of them is beautiful, pristine mountains in the background. The other is they're opening this with a wine opener. This is a product with incredible taste and quality and value, like a bottle of wine. So that's what you're getting in these messages. Here's one. This is Jennifer Aniston, the leading spokeswoman for Smart Water. And in fact, I believe she has actually a financial interest in the company. So the women in the audience may tell me differently, but my understanding is what she's selling is body image. Buy my bottled water and you can look like me. I can't, but maybe you can. And how much of our advertising is about body image or self-image in other forms? A lot of it, and the bottled water industry understands that. Fear. So this was an advertisement from a French bottled water company in Paris. Je ne bois pas l'eau que je l'utilise. I don't drink water that I utilize, that I use in a toilet. And I choose crystalline, this other bottled water choice. Fear. Now, interestingly, this advertising campaign really pissed off the French, the Paris municipal water system, which has a nice water system. And they actually launched a counter-campaign about the quality of Paris's municipal water system. And that's an interesting story in branding and marketing as well. This is a bizarre set of bottled water companies that are in fact marketing if you drink their bottled water, you will be spiritually improved. Either you can buy the one that is well-being, which is specially formulated to improve your health, or love, you drink this and I don't know what they think is going to happen. Or a bottle of strength. I mean, they're actually advertising that they've formulated their bottled water to provide certain benefits that we might want. And then sex. If you start watching advertisements with a critical eye, how much of them are actually completely unrelated to the product I don't know what they're suggesting if they buy this bottled water. We know what they're suggesting. But how much of it is just based on sex? And this was not advertised maybe to women, but maybe to men. I would also note this particular brand of bottled water, Bling, is the most expensive bottled water I've been able to find. It's about $40 or $50 a bottle. It's reprocessed anyway. The bottles are covered with Swarovski crystals. This is for people who have more money than they know what to do with. Okay, so advertising. Okay, so bottled water versus what? What's the option? So this is another interesting argument being made by the bottled water industry. What are our options? And part of the more sophisticated argument we've been hearing recently from the bottled water industry is that drink bottled water because it's better than drinking soda or sugary drinks. And so bottled water consumption is good because bottled water sales come not at the expense of tap water, but at the expense of other beverages. That's a brilliant argument. That's a really, really good argument. And here's the quote. This is from a spokesman from the IBWA, the International Bottled Water Association, quote, "Bottled water's competition is not your faucet, but the soft drinks, juices, sports drinks, and teas that people buy while they're on the go." And again, it's a great argument. Unfortunately, it's false. That's not what's going on. And this is a complicated question because the dynamics of sales of different kinds of beverages versus bottled water versus consumption of tap water is a hard thing to tease out. But let me show you a little bit of data that suggests to me why this is a false argument. So here are two bar charts from 1980 to 2006, which is the data are pretty similar for today. And the y-axis is gallons per person per year of different things that we Americans drink. And the blue part is carbonated soft drinks. Coke, Pepsi, all carbonated soft drinks. And the red is everything else, which includes milk, alcoholic beverages, beer, fruit juices, that kind of thing. That's the red. And the green at the top is bottled water. Okay, so there are a number of things to note here. First of all, in 1980, per capita consumption of commercial beverages was about 140 gallons per person per year. We drank 140 gallons a year of everything, the things that we buy. And a little bit of it was bottled water, 2.7 gallons per person per year. So this was sort of at the beginning of the bottled water phenomenon. By the late 2000s, the total consumption of purchased beverages had gone up to about 180 gallons per person per year. And you see the big increase in bottled water, and that's part of that first curve that I showed you. We started buying a lot more bottled water. And our consumption of carbonated soft drinks has gone up. That hasn't gone down, it's gone up. So we're not buying less Coke and Pepsi and all of those things, we're buying more of them. Consumption of these other things has gone down a little bit, but interestingly enough, that's mostly milk and some fruit juices. We're drinking less of that than we drank in 1980. But here's the other important thing to note. This increase of total consumption of commercial beverages, think about that for a minute. Are we just drinking more? Or are we all drinking about the same that we always drank? I mean, it's hard to imagine that we're drinking 40 gallons a year more of everything. We must be drinking less of something. Or else we're all really, really well hydrated. And we're not. We're not all drinking 40 gallons more a year. just over a decade. And that difference, it's about 30 gallons, 36 gallons, 40 gallons a year, is largely a decrease in the consumption of tap water. So this argument, it's a great argument if it were true. If we were replacing sugary drinks with water, bottled water or tap water, I'd sort of be a fan of that. You know, we have a sugar problem in this country. We all know that. That's a nutrition question. There's food conversations going on about that. If we were drinking more water and less sugary beverages, that would be a good thing, but I don't think that's what's going on. So take these arguments from the bottled water industry with a grain of salt, so to speak. So safety. What's really the story about bottled water versus tap water? That's a complicated question. So let me start by saying, is our tap water as safe as it needs to be? I would say no. I'm not here to argue that our tap water couldn't be safer. But I would also like to make the point that our bottled water is not as safe as we think it is. And to back up for a second, I would like our tap water system to be safer. But we have an incredibly great tap water system. We have a tap water system that much of the rest of the world wishes it had. And our tap water meets incredibly high standards most of the time. And there are new things in our water that ought to be removed, and there's new technology that we ought to invest in to upgrade the quality of our tap water. And for those of you that don't like the taste of your tap water, whether or not you think that's important enough to not drink it, we have the technology to make our tap water taste like anything. And in those cities where tap water may not taste good, the municipal agencies could invest in making our tap water taste better. So again, for those of you who have read the book, this pile of crickets may mean something to you. And for those of you who haven't, I'll tell you a little story. So while I was researching the book and looking at water quality issues and the complicated issues around tap water quality versus bottled water quality, I dug up data on bottled water recalls. And I'll talk in a minute about regulation and how those are managed. But it turns out that bottled water, like all food products, and bottled water is considered a food product, is sometimes recalled. Accidents happen at the bottling plant, or something's discovered in the water when we test the quality, and bottled water is sometimes recalled, like food products are sometimes recalled. And I ended up having to file a series of Freedom of Information Act requests to get the data from the FDA, which ought to have been public but was not, about bottled water recalls. And I ended up with data on about 100, a little over 100 bottled water recalls over the last several years. And each recall talks about the amount of water that was bottled and why it was recalled and what the contaminant was. And my favorite was a bottled water recall from a city in Texas. And the reason was it was found to have cricket parts in it. Cricket parts. Okay, so that was pretty unusual, hence the picture of crickets. There were other bottled water recalls because it had glass particles or bacteria or different chemicals, or, I mean, there are all sorts of examples. And there's a list of bottled water recalls on my website at the Pacific Institute if you're interested in the detail. But there was only one with crickets. And they didn't say which parts of the crickets. So I'm going to give you two quotes, one from the International Bottled Water Association and one from an environmental group, to give you some sense of the tension, if you will, about water quality and bottled water quality. So the Bottled Water Association says, bottled water's consistent safety and quality is due in part to the extensive FDA, Food and Drug Administration, requirements, individual state regulations, and industry standards which bottled water must meet. All of these combine to make bottled water one of the safest food products available for human consumption. Okay. Or Corporate Accountability International, an advocacy group that works to oppose bottled water, says water bottling is one of the least regulated industries in the US, much less regulated than our public tap water. Scientific studies even show that bottled water is no safer than tap water and can sometimes be less safe. Okay, there's truth in both of these statements, and there's complications in both of these statements. There are extensive FDA regulations and individual state regulations and industry standards that the bottled water industries meet or try to meet. Bottled water is probably one of the safest food products available for human consumption. That's probably also a true statement. Bottled water is much less regulated than our public tap water. I actually think that's also true. And studies have shown that bottled water is no safer than tap water. That's also true. And can sometimes be less safe. That's also true. You have to read these things really carefully. These are complicated issues. And there's truth sometimes, or half-truths, behind all of these difficult environmental questions. So for background, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, regulates our tap water under two of the most important national laws that we have, the Clean Drinking Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, both signed into law by a Republican president in the 70s. The Food and Drug Administration regulates bottled water as a food product. It's packaged in an individual container. That, by definition, becomes a food product. And so, first of all, we have two separate agencies regulating these two products. The standards for both are similar, but not identical. And in fact, the FDA standards are in part modeled after the EPA drinking water standards, but they're not identical. And in some cases, the FDA standards are weaker than the tap water regulatory standards. And there are some big loopholes, in my opinion, in the bottled water regulations. And ultimately, any water quality law is only as good as the level of protection, the frequency of inspections, the independence of those inspections, and the effectiveness of enforcement. And on all accounts, I argue here, and I argue in the book, that bottled water protections are inadequate, that they ought to be better than they are now. So here's some of those loopholes. US drinking water standards apply to all municipal water systems. You can't have one state with a weaker standard than another state for drinking water. FDA regulations only apply to food products sold in interstate commerce. And that exempts a high percentage of bottled water. If you bottled water at a bottling plant in California and it doesn't cross state lines, it's exempt from federal regulations. That's a loophole. And in fact, a tremendous amount of our bottled water is not sold in interstate commerce. It's a loophole. Viruses and other pathogenic organisms are not regulated in bottled water because bottled water is assumed, not tested, but assumed to be free from those things because of the way they define bottled water. And I could go into the details of that, and I won't for time, but it's a loophole. We don't test for those things because they're just assumed to be not present. And in fact, I think that's not always a safe assumption. Coliform bacteria rules are weaker for bottled water than they are for tap water. And coliform bacteria is in fact one of those contaminants that's often found in the bottled water recalls. Enforcement and testing. The Food and Drug Administration almost never inspects bottled water plants, and it very rarely tests water quality. The companies do their own testing, and they do their own reporting. Why? I wrote circular reasoning here, but what the argument is that because bottled water is so safe, FDA doesn't have to test whether it's safe. That's circular reasoning. And in fact, FDA, like many federal agencies, is grossly underfunded. They have very few enforcement agents. And there are serious problems in the food industry that require serious FDA enforcement. Although, if they had more money, they could expand the kinds of testing they do. FDA requires bottled water plants to analyze source water, that is the original source of the water that goes to the bottling plant, and finished products once a week for bacteria. Municipal systems with under 50,000 customers, a small municipal system, has to test for bacteria 60 times a month, 10 or 12 times a week. And big systems like San Diego or San Francisco or Los Angeles, big systems that have maybe more than 2.5 million customers, have to test dozens of times a day for bacteria. Municipal water systems are testing water dozens of times a day for a whole series of things to meet federal standards for water quality. And you may not like the taste of your water, your tap water, but your tap water is tested all the time to meet federal standards. And interestingly enough, when sometimes municipal systems fail, when there are problems with equipment, they're required to notify the public right away, that day or the next day, so that things can be fixed, so that the public can drink bottled water if they have to, or boil their water. I mean, there are emergency things that we do when our municipal systems fail. Just to go back for a second, these bottled water recalls, the other interesting thing about them was the FDA says the company, how many bottles were bottled, where they were sold, what the cause of the contamination was, and when the recall was. And the average time after bottling for when the recall occurred was 2 or 3 months. So the product is produced, it goes to the shelf, it's sold. 2 or 3 months later, there's a recall. That's not all that protective of public health, in my opinion. There are no mandatory requirements that the results of bottled water tests be sent to or confirmed by the FDA or released to the public. You don't get the data on bottled water tests. You get data from your municipal agency on their water tests all the time. That's public information. And in fact, every municipal agency now has on their website the results of their water quality tests. And I encourage you to look them up. Labeling. So Europe does things a little differently than we do. These are the constituents that the European Union requires be listed on the label of mineral waters sold in Europe, bottled mineral water sold in Europe. And it's everything. It's acidity, it's aluminum, arsenic, bromine, calcium. I mean, you can read the list for those of you who are not sitting in the back or asleep. It's a lot of different things. And Europe has always had a little more proactive, precautionary principle kind of approach to protecting public health. This is the US food label that you're all familiar with, and it's the label the FDA requires on bottled water. And in fact, this is a label from a bottle of water, and it shows calories, 0. There's no calories in water. And it shows total fat, and there's no fat in water. And it shows cholesterol, and there's no cholesterol in bottled water. And it shows carbohydrates, 0, and protein, 0, and vitamins, 0. Okay, look, we're talking about water. So, first of all, none of the things that we really are interested in, except maybe sodium, there's a little bit of sodium in this bottled water, is listed. Sodium's here. All sorts of salts are listed on the European, because in fact, all of these minerals, lots of minerals occur in water. You can't drink water without minerals. Water without minerals is distilled water, and it's bad for you. It's physically bad for you. You don't want to be drinking distilled water. So there are naturally occurring minerals in water, and that's what gives water its different tastes. And you don't like the taste of San Diego's water, some of you. That's in part because it's fairly high, relatively speaking, in different kinds of salts, well below the standards. But San Diego and Southern California water is relatively high in certain kinds of minerals. But this kind of a label is not helpful to us. It doesn't tell us, for water, the things that we want to know. And yet, because it's a food product and because the FDA doesn't regulate it very carefully, this is what we get. But there are other things about labeling that are kind of interesting, and there's branding. So what's in a name? And again, some of you in the back can't read this, but bottled water companies pick names that they think you're going to like. Aquafina, Evian, Fiji water, Arctic Wolf Spring, Arctic Clear, Arctic Springs, Arctic bottled water. I mean, Arctic is, the Arctic is pure. We happen to be melting it now, but it's pure. Glacier mountain natural spring water, Glacier bottled water, Glacier spring water, Alaska Premium Glacier, Everest, Yosemite. These are names of bottled waters. And on the right, I've listed where that water actually comes from. And just to give you a couple of examples, Arctic Clear comes from Bartlett, Tennessee. Arctic Springs comes from Los Angeles. Glacier Mountain Natural Spring Water comes from New Jersey. Okay, so the last time there were glaciers or mountains in New Jersey was the last ice age, which was about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. One of my favorites. Alaska Premium Glacier comes from pipe 11241 from the Juneau, Alaska Municipal Water System, which is neither premium nor glacier, in my opinion. Yosemite water came from the Los Angeles Municipal Supply. You get the idea. Branding. We're being advertised something that may not, when you dig down, be what you think it is. Lots of you have seen these. These are vending machines that sell bulk water. You can bring a container and you get filtered water. It has a filter in the machine. The company is called Glacier Water. And for 35 cents, what does this say? 35 cents, you can probably get a gallon of water. You bring your own bottle. Well, obviously, you're not getting Glacier water here. These machines are tied to the pipe of a municipal system. And they have filters in them, which may or may not have been cleaned in recent memory. And there was a court case about that. But it's part of branding. In addition, more and more bottled water actually originates as municipal tap water. In fact, about half of all bottled water sold in the United States starts as municipal water that a bottled water plant takes and sometimes repurifies or processes and puts in the bottle. Water that originally met federal drinking water standards, but is now being repackaged and sold to you for 1,000 times or 2,000 times more than you would pay for that same tap water. And Dasani and Aquafina and Nestle's Pure Life brands are all reprocessed municipal water. Dasani and Aquafina, which are Coke and Pepsi, Dasani and Aquafina, Coke and Pepsi's bottled water brands, are bottled at Coke and Pepsi bottling plants where they bottle Coke and Pepsi and all of the other commercial drinks that they produce. And sometimes they clean those bottling lines and they run bottled water and they bottle water at those plants. And they do that for a number of reasons. One is it feeds right into their local distribution system. That water is produced locally. And my guess is I I don't know for sure, well, I don't know for sure about San Diego, but I live in the East Bay, in the Bay Area. My office is in Oakland. There's a Coca-Cola bottling plant a few miles away, and the Dasani for our region, that's where it comes from. The other half, is typically called spring water. And if it says spring water on the bottle, by law, it's supposed to come from a groundwater aquifer or a spring that feeds a groundwater aquifer. And there are certain kinds of standards associated with that. Almost all of Nestle's other brands, not Pure Life, but in California, Arrowhead is a Nestle brand. Deer Park, they own about 20 different brands. What is it in Florida? It's, so anybody here from Florida? If you know the common bottled water. Anyway, those are spring waters. And Nestle's puts a lot of time and effort into finding protected aquifers so they can label their product spring water. And that's the other half of our bottled water industry. Plastics. Let me talk about plastics. You're all familiar with these symbols that appear on all of your plastic products, or you ought to be. Look at your plastic products at the bottom. There are these symbols, and the numbers reflect the kind of plastic that that's made out of. And number 1 goes up to 7, I believe. Number 1 is PET, polyethylene terephthalate. And all commercial beverages, pretty much, single-serve commercial beverages, are bottled in PET. Polyethylene terephthalate. Say that over and over again. I got good at it over the years. This is actually what a plastic bottle looks like before it's actually turned into the plastic bottle. They produce millions of these. They look like little test tubes with a screw top. They're put in machines and they're heated and they expand to the shape that whatever product is going into goes into. That's what a plastic bottle looks like before it becomes a bottle. Before it becomes this. This is a photo I took at a bottled water plant in Hawaii. And this is what happens after we're done with them. And so there's a solid waste problem. And this is a big problem in terms of the volume of solid wastes in the United States. But back to PET for a second. PET was invented in 1941, actually as part of the war effort, in order to identify plastics that could be used for containers, that could be used for clothing. Nylon was invented at around the same time. There was a big effort in the chemistry industry to develop different kinds of plastics. It's resistant to heat, to mineral oils, to solvents, to acids. It's impermeable to carbonation. That's why the Coke and Pepsi, the carbonated beverages you get, comes in PET. It's strong, it's light, it doesn't break when you drop it, it's transparent, and it's completely recyclable. This is a miracle plastic. And I actually believe that if we didn't have PET, we wouldn't have seen a big increase in the bottled water industry. If bottled water was restricted to aluminum cans or to glass, I think sales would be a lot lower. But this stuff is amazing. This stuff has made it easy and light and less expensive to bottle individual drinks and to sell them to all of us and to avoid breakage and to cut the costs of transportation. It's actually a pretty amazing thing. It doesn't impart a taste to its contents like some plastics do. And research, I'm going to be explicit here, the scientific research today suggests it does not leach any chemicals into whatever it's holding. That's, again, not true of many different kinds of plastics. But PET looks like it's not leaching any bad chemicals into whatever you're buying. It's really it's a wonderful plastic. And look, it's completely recyclable. But here's another important distinction. because the bottled water industry likes to say, this stuff is completely recyclable. It's 100% recyclable. There we go. The bottles our member companies produce are 100% recyclable. You don't have to take my word for it. There's the quote. Again, from my best friends, they love me, the International Bottled Water Association. And this was a full-page ad in the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle in 2007, a time when there was this big pushback from some of the advocacy groups against bottled water. It's 100% recyclable. I would just like to note there's a difference between recyclable and recycled. Keep that in mind. And at the moment, only about a third of our bottled water bottles are actually recycled. Now look, that's not the fault necessarily of the bottled water industry. We're not good in the United States at recycling. We do a lot better with glass. We do pretty well with aluminum. We don't do that well with plastic. We're not good recyclers. And some of you probably try really hard to recycle and are great at it. And some of us try hard, and then every now and then we throw something away that could be recycled. And some of our institutions don't make it as easy as they ought to recycle. And some of our cities don't make it as easy and some of our economic structures don't make it as economically attractive as it ought to be to recycle materials. But unfortunately, 2/3 of our plastic bottles end up in landfills or by the side of the road or in our streams or in our, out in the environment. And that's one of the problems with plastics. So as good as PET is, there are externalities, there are environmental liabilities associated with plastics. In addition, I don't think I have a slide about this, but plastic is really energy intensive. Plastic comes from petroleum and natural gas. It comes from fossil fuels. Plastics are fossil fuels, restructured. And we did an analysis at the Pacific Institute, an analytical study that looked at the amount of energy required to make bottled water altogether, which is the energy required to produce the plastic, and energy required to collect and treat the water, and energy required to move the water from where we bottle it to where we consume it, and the energy in your refrigerators or the refrigerators of our grocery stores to cool the bottled water. There are lots of energy in a lot of different pieces of that footprint. There's a big energy footprint to bottled water. And in fact, if you add it all up, the amount of petroleum, the equivalent energy in petroleum, would fill a bottle a third with petroleum. That's how much energy is required to make any bottle. If you have a 1 liter bottle of water, a third of a liter of petroleum is the energy required to make that bottle and to move it and to cool it and to treat it, but mostly to make the bottle. Most of that is in the plastic. Some cultures are better at recycling than others. This was a photo taken in China. Ironically, almost all of the plastics that we do recycle in the Western United States goes to China. It's put on cargo ships that are mostly empty because we buy a lot of stuff from China and we sell less stuff to China. So the economics of international trade are such that it's relatively cheap to ship stuff to China, including garbage or plastic garbage. And in China, they turn it into other things. They turn it into fiber fill for clothing. They turn it into cabling and plastic containers, and they turn it into toys made out of plastic that we then buy again. So they recycle a lot of our plastics, and that's part of the strange economics of resources around the world. So, some conclusions. I don't think bottled water is going to disappear. And I don't argue in my book that we ought to ban bottled water. But we need to understand that our production and consumption of bottled water has very serious environmental and economic and social costs. And like anything, there are environmental and economic and social and sometimes political implications of our purchases. And the more we understand about them, the more we have the opportunity to change the things that we do. to change our choices, to change the things we choose to buy, to change the way we build our cities and our universities, to change how we hold our corporations responsible for their role in sustainability. So let's tackle those problems directly, and let's tackle the reasons people buy bottled water. The questions about fear of our tap, the questions about access, the questions about branding and advertising. So what do? Let's support and expand state-of-the-art tap water systems. We've spent a lot of money to build a magnificent tap water system in the US that ought to be even better. We ought to be investing more money in upgrading our tap water systems, and there are parts of the world where we don't drink tap water, we drink bottled water because there are no good tap water systems. I drink bottled water, often of dubious origins, in places where I can't trust the tap water. But the answer is not bottled water for everyone. The answer is high-quality, low-cost municipal water for everyone. Because ultimately, bottled water is going to be too expensive for the poorest populations, no matter how cheap it is. And in those places, the poor are going to drink contaminated water, and the rich are going to drink bottled water. And that's a social equity issue. And it's already a social equity issue in places like China and in places like Africa, where the wealthier populations drink bottled water, and the poorer populations have no options. And they suffer the consequences of drinking contaminated water. Let's develop, pass, and enforce, the other piece of this puzzle, smarter water regulations. There's no reason why bottled water regulations should be any weaker than tap water regulations. And there's no reason why the FDA, except for lack of financial resources, shouldn't be enforcing the regulations we have better than we are. Let's protect consumers from fraud and misrepresentation. I don't think consumers should be given bottled water with labels that don't tell them anything. I don't think consumers should be exposed to brands that mislead them about what's actually in the bottle. And there's no federal requirement that a bottled water label says where that water comes from. Let's require truthful labeling. And let's reduce the impact of bottled water, the environmental impact. Let's expand recycling programs. Let's require, which we don't today, that plastic bottles have a certain amount of recycled plastic content. That would expand the demand for recycled plastics enormously. But all plastic in the United States comes from virgin plastic. It comes from petroleum products directly with no recycled water content. There's an example of a way to reduce the impact on the environment. Bottled water companies are working to reduce the amount of plastic in their bottle. And in fact, in the last 5 years, the amount of plastic in a bottle has decreased because companies have learned how to make stronger bottles with less plastic. That's a great thing, and I give them credit for that. It reduces their costs as well, so there's an economic incentive for them to do that. They're not necessarily doing this out of the goodness of their heart. Although increasingly, this is a whole separate talk, but increasingly, the whole issue of corporate social responsibility is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. And the smart companies, including some beverage companies, understand that they have a social responsibility and are working to reduce their environmental impact, to work with local communities to reduce challenges associated with their products and their supply chains. And there's some really interesting work. If you're in the business school or you're interested in economics or you're interested in marketing, there are some very innovative companies, including some beverage companies, doing work to deal with challenges around social responsibility around their products. It's a really interesting world in that area now. Let's build water fountains everywhere. And some of those fountains are smart fountains that refill bottles, refillable bottles. There are lots of designs now that could I would argue, lead to a revival of, in many ways, competition for smarter and smarter and more water fountains. We're beginning to see some of that. Some of the fountains on this campus now are some of these smart fountains. But in my conversations with students this afternoon, I don't think there's an inventory of water fountains on campus. There ought to be. You should all be able to find, maybe with an app on your phone, where the nearest water fountain is to you at any instant. And frankly, not on campus, but anywhere in the world. I would love to be able to pull out my phone, which I pull out only 500 or 600 times a day, like all of you, and be told where the nearest water fountain is. There's a water fountain 400 yards west of you, and it's working, and it's filtered, and it's chilled. And skip the one 300 yards away from you because it's broken. We could do that. I think we need a revival of efforts to enhance public access to water. So let me close with a couple of just fun pictures. Maybe this is a metaphor for where the bottled water industry ought to be, in the jaws of a dilemma. A friend of mine took this picture in Europe. And from the Friends of Irony, you can't see it at the bottom, but there's a website, Friends of Irony, Dasani, can't live without it, out of order. So let's do what we can to move to a more sustainable future. Water's a big issue, bottled water's a big piece of that puzzle, but it's not the biggest piece of that puzzle. There are challenges associated with water, but there are enormous opportunities, and they're educational, and they're scientific, and they're technology, and they're innovation, and there's smart communications that ought to be done around all of these issues. There's plenty for all of us to do. Thank you very much.